A flickering candle illuminates the stone walls of a cold medieval chamber. Wind howls through the shutters. In the corner, a wooden cradle rocks slightly, empty. A goblet of wine rests on a scroll-strewn table. A crown lies beside it, askew. Distant church bells toll, and a man, draped in furs and bad decisions, stares blankly into the fire. History has always been obsessed with great men, kings, conquerors, patriarchs. They built cathedrals and crushed rebellions. They signed treaties and launched crusades. But behind the thrones and banners, there were families, wives who waited, children who watched, legacies that whispered through bloodlines, often warped and forgotten. And among those legacies, some truly terrible fathers. Tonight, we journey into the dimly lit corners of medieval history, not to celebrate rulers, but to quietly shake our heads at the men who really shouldn't have had children. Some were cruel, others clueless. A few may have accidentally started wars over bedtime tantrums. So pull your blanket close. The fire is warm, the halls are quiet, and we're about to meet the worst dads history tried to quietly forget. Medieval fatherhood, expectations and absences. To understand these missteps, we must first remember what fatherhood looked like in the Middle Ages. Spoiler, it wasn't all playing knights in the garden and teaching kids how to joust. Medieval fatherhood, especially among the noble and royal classes, was rarely about emotional bonding. It was about securing bloodlines, training heirs, arranging marriages before children could speak in full sentences, and occasionally locking sons in towers until they learned obedience. Affection was not impossible. There are tender letters, preserved in parchment, that show genuine love, but more often than not, children were tools, pieces, on a dynastic chessboard. And when the game got too heated, fathers burned the board. Power makes a poor parent. With great power comes great irresponsibility. And many medieval rulers, armed with absolute authority and a deep mistrust of their own families, made disastrous dads. They feared their sons would steal their thrones. They married off their daughters for land and favors, sometimes more than once. They exiled, disinherited, and even executed their own flesh and blood in fits of paranoia. You see, being a bad dad in medieval times wasn't always about neglect. Sometimes it was far more active. A bad dad didn't just miss your birthday, he might try to have you excommunicated. The messy mix of blood and thrones. Royal families didn't just pass on names and titles, they passed down grudges. And when succession was unclear, children became bargaining chips or enemies. Picture this: a son outshining his father in battle, a daughter growing too clever for the marriage market, a younger sibling whispering in court shadows. These were not harmless teenage rebellions. These were political threats, and in a world where kings feared coups more than curses, the father figure could quickly become the executioner. The legacy of the bad dad. Why do we remember them? Not just because of cruelty, but because these broken relationships often shaped entire kingdoms. A neglected son becomes a ruthless king. A banished daughter marries into enemy hands. A father's obsession with legacy topples his own dynasty. These weren't isolated family dramas. They were earthquakes that sent tremors through medieval history. And while the castles may have crumbled, the stories endured, not as bedtime tales, but as slow-burning lessons in power, pride, and the strange sorrows of medieval fatherhood. The courtyard of a Gothic palace in Paris. The sky is pale grey, the wind sharp. Monks chant in the distance. A king stands on a high balcony, cold-eyed and motionless, watching three young men spar below. The clatter of swords echoes, but he does not smile. He does not move. He only calculates. He was called the Iron King. Tall, silent, and severe, Philip IV of France ruled with a grip like stone. He crushed the Knights Templar. He outwitted the Pope. He centralized the monarchy and modernized the kingdom. A master of cold statecraft, a statue that breathed. But behind that icy gaze was a man who failed, completely, utterly, and perhaps fatally, as a father. A crown built on suspicion. Philip ruled from 1285 to 1314. And during that time, France became more powerful, more feared, and more tightly controlled than ever before. But his victories came at a cost. He trusted very few people, and unfortunately, that included his own children. Philip had 3 sons and 1 daughter. All 3 sons, Louis, Philip, and Charles, would eventually become kings, yet none of them would rule well. None of them would leave lasting legacies, and none of them seemed prepared for the burdens of a crown, because their father, for all his brilliance, never taught them how to rule. He taught them only how to obey. Daughter of scandal, Isabella and the broken marriage. Philip's only daughter, Isabella, was perhaps his most historically significant child. He married her off to Edward II of England in a political alliance, a strategic victory, but a personal disaster. Edward had little interest in Isabella, choosing instead to surround himself with male favorites and ignoring his wife in court. Isabella was humiliated, and Philip, despite his vast power, did nothing. He had sent her away like a piece on a chessboard. And when that piece was wounded, he simply turned the board. Later, Isabella would lead a rebellion against her husband Edward, deposing him and becoming a key figure in English history. But that's another bedtime story. Tonight, she remains the daughter used, not loved. The Tour de Nesle affair, a father's paranoia, realized now for the scandal that truly haunts Philip's legacy. In 1314, Philip accused his daughters-in-law of adultery, a grave and dangerous charge. According to the story, his daughter Isabella, yes, the same one in England, noticed that 2 noblemen were receiving mysterious embroidered purses from her French sisters-in-law. She reported it to her father. What followed was a royal investigation more befitting a spy novel than a medieval court. 2 knights were arrested, tortured, and executed. The princesses were imprisoned. One would die in confinement. It's unclear whether the accusations were true, but Philip acted as judge, jury, and executioner, destroying his own family's honor in public view. His sons, humiliated and powerless, stood by, silent and broken. Sons who couldn't rule. After Philip's death in 1314, his 3 sons took the throne one by one. Louis X ruled for 2 years and died suddenly after playing a game of tennis and drinking cold wine. Philip V ruled for 6 years, clever but childless. Charles IV, the youngest, ruled for 5 years and also died without a male heir. 3 sons, 3 kings, 3 short, unhappy reigns, and when the last one died, the Capetian dynasty, the line of kings stretching back centuries, came to a quiet, awkward end, because Philip, for all his strength, had passed down nothing lasting, no guidance, no unity, no warmth, only ambition, and a legacy that crumbled as soon as his shadow vanished. A curse or a consequence? Some whispered that Philip had been cursed by the dying Grand Master of the Knights Templar, whom he had burned at the stake, a poetic end for a cruel reign. But maybe it wasn't a curse. Maybe it was simply what happens when power becomes a wall instead of a bridge, when a father sees his children not as heirs, but as pieces to be moved. Philip the Iron King was many things: a genius of state, a force of law, a master manipulator. But in the end, he was a man who raised kings who didn't know how to be sons. A windswept beach, black volcanic stone, glistens in the mist. A distant shape rises from the sea. Dragonstone, carved from ancient obsidian, jagged and defiant. Overhead, a shadow circles. The beat of leathery wings. Something approaches. Westeros had known war before. It had seen invasions, raids, betrayals, and sieges. But it had never known dragons, and it had never known Aegon. Aegon of House Targaryen. The Conqueror. He was not a king, not yet. He was simply a lord of Dragonstone. A tall, quiet man with silver hair, purple eyes, and a mind that measured in centuries, not days. By his side were his two sisters, Visenya and Rhaenys, each a dragon rider, each a weapon of war in their own right. And together, the three siblings had a dream, not of conquest, but of unification. Westeros was fractured, 7 kingdoms vying for dominance, locked in endless conflict. Aegon believed it could be one realm, not for glory, but for order. Of course, order would come in the shape of fire. 3 dragons, 3 riders. They had what no one else in Westeros possessed: dragons. Aegon rode Balerion, the Black Dread, the largest dragon ever known, whose wings could darken a castle and whose fire melted stone. Visenya rode Vagar, nearly as fearsome, with a temper as cold as her rider's steel. Rhaenys rode Meraxes, graceful and curious, a mirror to her laughter and light. With these creatures, Aegon did not simply march to war. He soared above it, the resistance of the 7 kingdoms. At first, the kings of Westeros laughed. The Storm King, the king in the north, the Reach, the Riverlands, each believed their armies strong, their walls thick, their loyalty unbreakable. But they had never faced fire made flesh. Castles burned, armies crumbled beneath wings and flame. At Harrenhal, the proudest and strongest fortress in the land, Lord Harren the Black refused to yield. He had stone walls hundreds of feet thick. He died screaming inside them as Balerion turned Harrenhal into a tomb of ash. The message was clear: stone cannot stop dragons. The bendings of the knee. Not all rulers resisted. Some chose wisdom. House Stark of the North sent Torrhen Stark, the last king in the North, who looked upon Aegon's army and his dragons and chose peace over pride. He bent the knee, earning the nickname the King Who Knelt. The rulers of the Vale and the Westerlands followed suit, and with each knee that bent, Aegon's dream solidified. He was no longer a foreign invader. He was the king of Westeros. King's Landing, a new capital from Ash Aegon, did not take the capital of another. He made his own. On the mouth of the Blackwater Rush, where his armies first landed, he built a city of wood and stone. He called it King's Landing. At its center, he constructed the Red Keep, a symbol of power that would outlive dynasties. And above it, on the highest hill, he placed a throne unlike any in history, the Iron Throne, forged from the swords of his enemies, twisted and sharp. It was not comfortable, it was not meant to be. It was meant to remind. Aegon the ruler, fire with restraint. Despite his fearsome conquest, Aegon was no tyrant. He kept local lords in power. He respected ancient customs. He called great councils and took oaths. He knew that fire could win a crown, but it could not hold it. And so, he ruled with a balance of strength and silence. His sisters sat beside him, Visenya with her blade, dark sister, Rhaenys with her songs and smiles. Together, they shaped a new order. One realm, one king, one dynasty, and beneath them, Westeros began to change. The legacy of the conquest Aegon ruled for 37 years. He brought peace where war had festered. He built roads, minting coins stamped with his dragon sigil. He founded institutions that would shape the realm for generations. But more than that, he left behind a story of dragons in the sky, of fire sweeping down on old crowns, of a dream larger than a throne. He became legend, and like all legends, he cast a shadow long after his death. Some say he conquered the world. Others say the world is still recovering. A snow-covered courtyard in Moscow. The wind slices through bare branches. Inside the thick stone walls of the Kremlin, a fire crackles low. A Tsar paces alone. His robes are dark. His eyes burn. In the corner, a portrait of a son, unblinking, unfinished, rests against a wall, unhung, unforgotten. Some fathers are cold, some are cruel. But Ivan IV of Russia, the first crowned Tsar of all Rus, was something else entirely. He was brilliant, he was brutal, and in the end, he may have become the darkest kind of father, one who feared his own love. Tonight, we walk the quiet corridors of Ivan's mind, if only briefly, and try to understand how one man could conquer a continent, yet lose his son with a single strike. A childhood of shadows. Ivan was born in 1530, heir to the Grand Duchy of Moscow. He became Grand Prince at age 3 when his father died, and then his life unraveled. His mother ruled as regent for just 5 years before dying, almost certainly poisoned by rival boyars, nobles. After that, Ivan was raised not with affection or tutors, but with neglect and humiliation. Nobles beat him, starved him, mocked him. He learned to read, surrounded by cruelty, and to rule by watching fear bend powerful men. So, by the time he declared himself Tsar of all Russia at age 16, he wasn't just ready to rule, he was ready to terrify. The father Tsar Ivan married multiple times, perhaps 7, though only the first, Anastasia Romanovna, seemed to temper his worst impulses. When she died under suspicious circumstances, Ivan snapped. He believed the boyars had poisoned her. He withdrew, then returned. Not as a king, but as a storm. He created the Oprichnina, a private police force loyal only to him. He tortured nobles, executed whole families, rode black horses through the streets in robes like a priest of death. And yet, through it all, he remained a father. To sons he alternately praised, punished, and eventually destroyed. Ivan Ivanovich, the son and the heir. Ivan's eldest and most beloved son was Ivan Ivanovich. The younger Ivan was capable, intelligent, and loyal. He accompanied his father into battle. He governed territories. He was, by all accounts, everything a ruler should be. But Ivan the Terrible was not a man who shared power easily. In 1581, a bitter argument broke out. Accounts differ on the cause. Some say Ivan struck his pregnant daughter-in-law for dressing immodestly. Others say it was about military strategy or court politics. What we do know is this: Ivan Ivanovich confronted his father. Words were exchanged, and then Ivan the Terrible struck his son with a staff. A single blow, a sudden, irreversible moment. The younger Ivan fell, bleeding. He died days later. The cry heard through the Kremlin legend says that when Ivan realized what he had done, he wept over his son's body, sobbing and begging for forgiveness. But it was too late. The son who might have ruled wisely, who might have changed Russia's future, was gone, and the father, now truly terrible. What came after Ivan lived for 3 more years, haunted and increasingly unstable. His surviving son, Fyodor, was gentle and pious, but completely unfit to rule. And so, When Ivan died in 1584, Russia entered a period known as the Time of Troubles. Civil war, famine, foreign invasions, a void where a dynasty had stood, and all because a father, shaped by pain, passed that pain along, in a single heartbeat, with a single hand. The icon that never fades. There is a painting, one of the most famous in Russian art, by Ilya Repin. It shows Ivan cradling his dying son, his face twisted in grief and horror, his hands red, his eyes wide, and no forgiveness left in the room. The image captures what centuries of history struggle to explain. A father who loved, a father who destroyed, a man who became a legend, not for what he built, but for what he broke. A rain-soaked English forest. Hooves squelch through the mud. A scribe rides behind a king, soaked and silent, clutching rolls of parchment. Somewhere in the mist, a castle looms. Its walls echo not with cheers, but with suspicion. The year is 1215. The king is John, and the future of fatherhood, monarchy, and feudal loyalty is hanging by a thread. When people think of bad kings, King John often comes near the top. Cruel, petty, greedy, and famously unlucky, he's remembered best as the villain in Robin Hood stories. But behind the tales of overtaxed peasants and stolen thrones, John was also a father, and not a particularly good one. Tonight, we explore how a king who lost a kingdom also lost something more personal: the loyalty and lives of his children. A legacy of insecurity. John was the youngest son of Henry II of England and Eleanor of Aquitaine. He was never meant to be king. His older brothers, especially Richard the Lionheart, were warriors, adventurers, and icons of medieval royalty. John, by contrast, was, well, not. He was clever, bookish, politically astute, but lacking in charisma and deeply mistrusted. Even his father nicknamed him Lackland because he had no lands or inheritance of his own. That insecurity festered, and when he finally became king in 1199, he ruled with paranoia and spite. Not a great foundation for fatherhood. A kingdom unraveled. As king, John alienated nearly everyone. He lost Normandy and much of the Angevin Empire to the French. He quarreled with the Pope, leading to England's excommunication. He imposed harsh taxes and levies, enraging his barons. He earned the nickname John Softsword for his military failures. Amid these political disasters, he fathered legitimate and illegitimate children. Some estimates say over a dozen. But perhaps none of his failures cut as deep as what happened with his eldest son, Arthur. Nephew versus Father Arthur of Brittany wasn't John's son, but rather his nephew and rival heir. When Richard the Lionheart died, many nobles believed Arthur had a better claim to the throne than John did. Arthur was young, popular, and crucially, not John. John responded with swift brutality. He captured Arthur in battle, imprisoned him in Rouen, and then the boy disappeared. Most historians agree that Arthur was murdered, likely on John's orders. Some claim John himself did the deed. Whether true or not, the murder of a teenage rival, especially one so closely related, earned John an infamous reputation. It also cast a long, cold shadow over his role as a father to his actual children, Henry, Richard, and Joan, children of a tainted throne. John's legitimate children with his second wife, Isabella of Angoulême, included Henry III, who would eventually rule for 56 years. Richard, later Earl of Cornwall, Joan, married off to a Scottish king, and several others, each used as political pawns. John wasn't known for spending time with his children. Instead, he used them in the same way he used treaties, castles, and coins, as bargaining chips. Joan was married at 10. Richard was granted titles to buy baronial loyalty, and young Henry, he inherited not a kingdom, but a civil war, the Magna Carta, and a father's final failure. In 1215, after years of misrule, John's barons forced him to sign the Magna Carta. It wasn't about love or justice. It was a desperate attempt to limit the king's power and protect the realm from him. John, of course, broke his promises almost immediately. War followed. He died a year later, in 1216, from dysentery, alone and unloved, clutching the crown he'd tried so hard to hold. His son, Henry III, became king at just 9 years old, inheriting not only the throne, but the hatred his father had earned, the legacy of Lackland. Today, King John is remembered as one of England's worst monarchs, but he was more than a bad ruler. He was a man who treated loyalty as weakness, family as property, and love as a risk he couldn't afford. In trying to protect his power, he corrupted it. In trying to preserve his legacy, he poisoned it. And in the end, he left behind children who ruled out of necessity, not inspiration. A quiet medieval chapel, its stained glass casting soft patterns on the stone floor. A carved wooden bench creaks under the weight of time. Candles flicker, half melted. Their light dances across statues of long-dead kings, some with swords, others with scrolls. But none smile, and none hold a child's hand. We've walked cold corridors and crimson courts. We've met kings who ruled with iron fists and fathers who shattered their own bloodlines. Tonight, as the fire burns low and the voices of history grow faint, we ask the question they never could. What makes a legacy last? Because for all their power and palaces, these men, these fathers, left behind more than laws and land. They left behind fractures, a thread of cruelty. Across the medieval world, from the snow-dusted Kremlin to the windswept towers of England, a pattern emerges. The worst fathers weren't always monsters from the start. They were often sons, once neglected, betrayed, or used, who grew into men armed with crowns and scars. What they lacked in tenderness, they made up for in terror. Some feared their children would take their thrones. Others feared their children would become them. And some, in moments of rage or calculation, ended their children's lives in order to protect their own power. These were not parenting mistakes. They were dynastic detonations. And they changed the course of nations, broken houses and empty thrones. Let's recall where we've been. Philip IV of France, whose cold control led to scandal, imprisonment, and the extinction of his male line. Peter the Cruel of Castile, who ruled through revenge and died at the hands of his own half-brother. Ivan the Terrible, who murdered the son who was most like him, dooming his dynasty to chaos. John of England, whose paranoia and neglect sparked rebellion, war, and a legacy of distrust that outlived him by centuries. Each of them held immense power, each wore a crown, but none could wear the role of father without turning it into another battlefield. Forgotten children, faded names. There were others, of course. We didn't speak of Charles VI of France, whose madness cast a long shadow over his son, the future Charles VII, or Frederick II, the Holy Roman Emperor, whose scientific brilliance and political prowess did not extend to nurturing his many heirs, one of whom tried to overthrow him, or the countless unnamed nobles who bartered their children into loveless marriages, sold daughters like currency, or kept sons locked away for fear of rivalry. In medieval Europe, fatherhood was often a calculation, not a connection, and those calculations rarely added up. The quiet lesson in the chaos. So what do we take from this candlelit march through royal dysfunction? Perhaps something simple. That power, without compassion, hollows out everything it touches. That love, if not spoken, can disappear beneath the weight of duty. And that history does not forget the throne, but it quietly remembers the father behind it. Not in grand statues or golden crowns, but in broken letters, in silent halls, in children who never became what they might have. And that is legacy too. A final thought before sleep. If there's a soft comfort in these hard histories, it's this, that even in failure, these men taught us something. Not how to rule, not how to conquer, but how not to love. And that in remembering them, we do not praise. We witness, and we promise, perhaps silently, beneath warm blankets and flickering screens, to do better, to be better, to make space for gentler kings.